Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to do the heavy lifting for you, taking complex source material and turning it into clear, usable knowledge.
And today we are diving into Australia, but we're really focusing in on one specific region, a region that is, just a place of breathtaking contradictions. We're talking about Queensland.
Right, and if you're thinking Queensland, I know Queensland, you're probably thinking the Sunshine State.
Exactly. You're thinking about the Great Barrier Reef, the Gold Coast, the tourist spots, but that's really missing the much bigger, more profound story.
So our mission today, with this really comprehensive source material we have, is to unpack that, to get into the almost unimaginable scale of the place.
And to really analyze this dual identity, it's forged. On one hand, you have these intense geographical extremes, and on the other, a really challenging, often brutal history.
And all of that is governed by this unique political engine that's been built to manage this huge, decentralized, and incredibly resource-rich kind of empire.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's get into the scale right away, because that really changes how you have to think about the state. It's in the northeastern corner of Australia, of course.
It's got these huge borders with the Northern Territory, South Australia, and New South Wales.
But the size, that's the monumental fact that just demands your attention. It spans an incredible 1,723,030 square kilometers.
It's a staggering figure. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your head around it, especially for a subnational entity, a state.
And according to the source material, that size makes Queensland the sixth largest governmental subdivision of any country on Earth.
In the world. To give you some context on that, it's larger than all but 16 sovereign nations. It's bigger than France, Germany, and Spain put together.
Wow. And twice the size of Texas.
Twice the size of Texas, yeah.
That size comparison is just incredible. But this vastness, it exists in this huge paradox when you actually look at where people live, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You have over 5.5 million people in Queensland. But here's the kicker. Nearly 3 out of every 4 of them live in this tiny, tightly concentrated little corner.
The area they call South East Queensland, or SEQLD.
Exactly. And that concentration is really the key to understanding the state's politics, its internal dynamics, everything.
So the capital, Brisbane, which is Australia's third largest city, has about half the state's entire population.
It does. Which means that all that other immense resource-rich territory, we're talking about the other 95% of the landmass, is governed and serviced by a state structure that is just overwhelmingly centered on this one small urban corner.
That structural split is fascinating. It means a huge portion of Queensland's political power is, it's structurally divorced from the sheer economic output of that vast interior.
Precisely. And you can see this historical tension throughout its entire history. It's a tension between that ambitious, bold frontier spirit you needed to conquer the territory.
And the desire to maintain stability, to maintain tradition.
Right. And it's perfectly encapsulated by the state's motto, Audax et Fidelis.
Which is Latin for bold but faithful.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. The boldness you need for exploration and development, especially in those incredibly harsh inland regions.
But also that deep conservatism and political faithfulness that really defines so much of its modern identity. That motto is the thread we're going to be pulling on throughout this whole deep dive.
Okay, so to understand the modern state, we have to start with its deep history.
We do, and we're talking deep history. Aboriginal ownership of this land goes back before 50,000 BC. This was not some empty continent just waiting to be discovered.
No, it was a complex, continuous civilization.
Absolutely. The early populations are thought to have moved across the continent either by boat or across the land bridge that used to connect to Papua New Guinea.
The land bridge through the Torres Strait, which is now underwater.
Right. And over tens of thousands of years, they developed into more than 90 distinct language and cultural groups, all adapted to these wildly different ecological systems.
And what's truly fascinating from our sources is the innovation these early populations showed, especially when faced with, an environmental catastrophe.
You're talking about the last ice age. The material highlights this critical turning point when the climate became much more arid, much more desolate.
Which led to huge food scarcity across the interior of the continent.
And this extreme environmental challenge, it spurred this incredible technological leap. It was during this period, probably because they needed to use tough, dry seeds to survive.
They developed what our sources confidently describe as the world's first seed grinding technology.
Which is monumental. I mean, think about that. A primal innovation prompted purely by the need to survive in a climate that had just turned hostile.
Then, as the glacial period ended, the climate warmed up again.
And that brought high rainfall along that eastern coast, which in turn fueled the rapid growth of the state's famous tropical and subtropical rainforests that we see today.
So you have this continuous adaptive 50,000-year history, and then you get the first faint ripples of European contact.
Very early contact, too. Back in 1606, the Dutch navigator Willem Jan Zoon landed near what is now Waipa on the Cape York Peninsula.
And that marks the first recorded landing of a European in Australia.
It does. But the actual colonial process, that didn't really begin in earnest for another century and a half until Lieutenant James Cook's voyage in 1770.
Cook mapped the entire eastern coastline, claiming it all for King George III, and he named the whole territory, which included what would become Queensland, New South Wales.
And for decades after that, it just remained largely undeveloped by the British.
Until the physical British presence began, and it began as a punitive exercise.
Exactly. The first permanent British settlement was the Moreton Bay penal settlement, set up by John Oxley in 1824. And it was specifically designed to house secondary offenders.
So these were convicts who had committed more crimes after they'd already arrived in Sydney.
Which means it was a place known for its incredibly harsh discipline. A penal colony within a penal colony.
The initial location was Redcliffe, but they quickly moved it to where Brisbane's central business district is now. Better resources.
Right. And crucially, the transportation of convicts officially ended in 1839. And free settlement, which had sort of been creeping in anyway, was officially permitted in 1842.
And that transition from a penal colony to a free colony, that is the exact moment that the history takes this profoundly dark and violent turn.
It really is. It set the stage for one of the most brutal periods in all of Australian colonial history. The source material pulls no punches on this.
It describes the frontier wars fought between the European settlers and the Aboriginal tribes in Queensland as the bloodiest and most brutal in colonial Australia.
And these conflicts, which, when they're analyzed now, decades later, are frequently seen as acts of genocide.
The scale of the violence is it's heartbreaking, and we need to spend some time on these numbers from the source.
They weren't just isolated skirmishes. This was widespread. It covered at least 644 documented collisions or massacres.
And the estimated total fatalities are just staggering. At least 66,680 people killed.
And of those deaths, an estimated 65,180 were Aboriginal people.
The sources really don't pull any punches on this. This period just casts an extremely long shadow over the state's foundation.
It does. And that massive disparity in the death toll, it highlights the systematic mechanism of control that was put in place, particularly the use of the native police.
Can you explain what that was?
It was a paramilitary force operating from 1849 well into the 1920s, and it was central to clearing the frontier for settlement.
And the structure of the force itself was designed for maximum effectiveness in suppressing any resistance.
It was. It was made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander troopers, but they were always strictly commanded by white officers. And the source notes, they were often forcefully recruited from communities hundreds of miles away.
To ensure they had absolutely no local ties, no loyalties, or any cultural inhibitions about fighting the people they were sent to police. A deliberate strategy.
A very deliberate and brutal strategy. And the violence just spread like wildfire after 1842, driven by this intense rush for land.
Especially the rich grazing areas, like the Darling Downs and the Brisbane Valley.
Right. And the source material really illustrates the asymmetry of the violence. It details the deadliest attacks on settlers versus the massacres of Aboriginal people. The Cullen Laringo massacre in 1861 is often cited as the worst attack on white civilians.
Where 19 settlers died.
Yes. And the response to Cullen Laringo was swift, it was merciless, and it was completely disproportionate. In the weeks right after, police, native police units, and local posses killed up to 370 members of the Gayeri Aboriginal people in a campaign of retaliation.
A pattern of massive overreaction.
Tragically common.
Yeah.
The sources also cite things like the Kilcoy and Whiteside poisonings. These are two of the largest documented massacres in the Southeast.
And in these incidents, up to 70 Aboriginal lives were lost in separate events through the heinous tactic of offering flour laced with strychnine as a supposed gift.
The sheer intensity of the conflict even forced some of the early settlements to become, effectively, armed camps.
And this violence just followed the settlers north It peaked again during the 1870s gold rush on the northern mining frontier.
particularly around the Palmer and Hodgkinson River gold fields. The final large-scale resistance that our sources note was led by the Kelkadoon people.
And they've successfully held settlers out of western Queensland for 10 years.
They did, until they were finally overwhelmed and defeated at a place called Battle Mountain near Cloncurry in 1884.
So if the frontier wars enabled the bloody acquisition of the land, the practice of blackbirding provided the labor to then exploit it.
And this represents a really uncomfortable truth about the colonial economy's foundation, particularly in the state's agricultural belt.
Because even though the Slavery Abolition Act had passed in 1833 across the British Empire,
Queensland's economy relied heavily on what the sources describe as blackbirded South Sea Islander slavery, or at the very least, indentured servitude under horrific conditions.
this is a dark chapter. It's often less prominent in the global history books, but it was absolutely central to the colony's wealth.
It was. The practice of blackbirding, where workers were either forced or deceived or coerced into years of indentured servitude, was a core economic driver from 1863 all the way up until 1908.
The scale of this forced migration was just immense.
Between 55,000 and 62,500 South Sea Islanders were transported, mainly from Melanesia, so islands in Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands.
And they were shipped over to work in the agricultural sector.
Especially the incredibly arduous and profitable sugarcane fields of the central and northern coasts. The vast majority were male, and alarmingly, the sources say about a quarter of them are minors under the age of 16.
That number is just devastating. It really forces you to completely rethink that Sunshine State image.
Well, it does. Our source material notes that approximately 15,000 South Sea Islanders, that's roughly 30% of the total, died while they were laboring in Queensland.
Often from disease, overwork, or just the harsh conditions during their initial 3-year contracts.
And that 30% mortality rate in just the first 3 years, that's the figure that provides the crucial historical context.
Because the sources explicitly compare it.
They explicitly compare this devastating mortality rate to the estimated 33% death rate among enslaved Africans during the early period of the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas.
Which suggests that, despite the legal technicality of it being indentured labor,
The actual conditions were comparable to outright slavery. This labor built the state's foundational industry.
and this extremely profitable system, which enriched prominent early settlers like Robert Towns, who the city of Townsville is actually named after, it didn't end because of humanitarian concern.
No, it ended abruptly due to political calculation right after Australia federated in 1901.
Which is that critical connection to the national history.
It is. The Pacific Island Laborers Act, 1901, was one of the very first pieces of legislation passed by the new Commonwealth, and it was driven by the nascent white Australia policy.
The goal being to ensure a strictly white labor force.
Exactly. So this act effectively deported the vast majority of these foreign workers. The Pacific Islander population of the state just plummeted in a very short period. The sugar industry had been fundamentally built on their labor.
And its immediate deportation was a foundational pillar of Australian racial policy at the federal level.
Yes.
Okay, let's pivot now to the political progression that led to statehood. The desire for separation from New South Wales had been growing since 1851.
Mostly driven by the geographic distance and the feeling that Sydney was just neglecting the Northern Territories.
And it finally became official on June 6, 1859, when Queen Victoria signed the letters patent establishing the colony of Queensland.
And that day, Queensland Day, is still celebrated. Sir George Bowen was the first governor, Robert Herbert the first premier. But the young colony was born on very unstable financial footing.
It quickly faced the threat of economic collapse.
A crisis that was averted, once again, by the resource bounty of the land.
The Gympie Gold Rush.
The Gympie Gold Rush. It began in 1867 with James Nash's discovery of gold on the Mary River, and it provided a vital, timely economic boost. It was smaller than the Victorian rushes, for sure.
But it produced enough wealth to inject that desperately needed capital and stabilize the new colonial government.
Right. And then moving into the 20th century, you see this rapid political and social modernization.
Yeah.
Women gained the right to vote in state elections in 1905.
Although Aboriginal women and men would have to wait decades longer.
Decades longer, yes.
Yeah.
The University of Queensland was established in 1909.
Yeah.
And you also see this unique early contribution to global health.
The polio treatments.
Yes, the first alternative treatments for polio were pioneered in Queensland starting in 1911. And elements of those are apparently still used in rehabilitation globally.
Aviation history is also fundamentally tied to the sheer vastness of Queensland.
It had to be. Australia's first major airline, Qantas, which is an acronym for Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services,
It was founded in the outback town of Winton in 1920.
which just clearly demonstrates that early recognition of the geographic scale and the absolute necessity of fast, long-distance transport to connect those remote regions to the capital.
And the state's geography also made it a critical strategic asset during World War II.
Oh, absolutely. Brisbane wasn't just another port. It became central to the entire Allied campaign in the Southwest Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur set up his headquarters there.
He was effectively running the war in that theater from Brisbane until 1944.
He was. But this massive American military presence, it also led to significant internal friction.
Which erupted into that shocking incident in 1942 known as the Battle of Brisbane.
Yeah, a violent clash between visiting U.S. military personnel and Australian servicemen and civilians. It was fueled by cultural differences, perceived arrogance, competition for resources for women.
It resulted in one death and hundreds of injuries. It really underscores the simmering tensions caused by that sudden, massive influx of foreign military power into the city.
And then the post-WWII era that ushered in these sustained demographic shifts. Initially, you had a wave of European migration, especially Italians, who were drawn to work in the sugarcane industry.
But the real demographic engine of modern Queensland has been internal migration.
Yes, the source material notes that starting in the later decades of the 20th century, that warm, humid, subtropical climate, which had previously been a deterrent, it became a massive draw.
Largely thanks to the widespread availability of air conditioning.
Exactly. And Queensland has consistently had the highest rate of interstate net migration in Australia since the 1970s. People from the southern states were just fleeing the cold weather for the Queensland lifestyle.
And that internal boom was compounded by the end of the White Australia policy in 1973.
Which opened the door to a significant wave of international immigration, most prominently from Asia. And that has fundamentally reshaped the state's culture and commerce, especially in the cities. And it continues to drive that population engine today.
Okay, so let's move now to the physical state itself. The sheer scale of Queensland's geography, it dictates every aspect of its life.
From politics to the economy, everything. To the east, you've got the Coral Sea and the Pacific Ocean.
But the boundaries themselves are just a testament to its vastness.
They really are. To the north, you have the Torres Strait, separating the state from Papua New Guinea. The Gulf of Carpentaria defines the whole northwestern coastline. And to the west, the boundary with the Northern Territory is just a dead straight line.
It runs precisely along the 138th meridian east.
Just a line on a map.
And the southern boundary with New South Wales is this fascinating mix of colonial compromise and natural features, isn't it?
It is. It starts in the east, following the watershed of the Great Dividing Range. Then it shifts to follow a series of rivers, and then it becomes a straight line again.
The 29th parallel south. It's a complex border that really reflects that historical struggle to delineate territory based on resources and claims.
Absolutely. But internally, the most defining geographic feature, without a doubt, is the Great Dividing Range.
This massive system of mountains and plateaus that runs parallel to the eastern coast.
It's the state's backbone, and its presence dictates where people live, how the economy functions, everything.
So can we elaborate on the impact of that geological feature?
We can. It's the fundamental climate and demographic divider. It acts like a massive wall. It traps all the moisture coming in from the Pacific and Coral Seas along that coastal strip.
So that means that 75% of the population lives in that small, geographically diverse 5% of the land that's humid and fertile.
Exactly. And once you move west of the range, the land just rapidly transitions into arid, semi-arid, and desert conditions.
The other 95% of the state.
Which is far more sparsely populated, but holds the vast majority of the state's mineral and cattle wealth.
That structural split people on one side, resources on the other, that is so critical. Now, what about the sheer natural wealth? Queensland has an incredible concentration of natural treasures. 6 World Heritage-listed preservation areas.
Which is a massive claim to global natural significance. You have the Great Barrier Reef, the single largest living structure on Earth.
Running over 2,300 kilometers parallel to the coast.
Then you have K'gari, formerly Fraser Island, the world's largest sand island. You've got the wet tropics, which includes the ancient Daintree rainforest.
Lamington National Park, the Riversley fossil sites up in the northwest.
Which document millions of years of mammalian evolution. and the Gondwana rainforests in the southeast. It's an incredible list.
And as if Kagari wasn't enough, Queensland also happens to have the world's three largest sand islands right off its coastline: Kagari, Moreton Island, and North Stradbroke Island.
It really is a land of world records and unique formations.
So to help us navigate this massive area, the sources break Queensland down into major unofficial regions.
Right, and each one has a really distinct identity that's tied directly to that geographical divide we talked about.
Let's start with the urban core. South East Queensland, SEQLD.
This is the densely populated corner. Over 70% of the state's residents are here. It includes Brisbane, the glitter strip of the Gold Coast, and the sprawling Sunshine Coast. This is the economic and political center of gravity.
And then moving slightly inland from there.
You find the Darling Downs and the Granite Belt. The Downs are all about fertile agriculture, grain production, but the Granite Belt is the mountainous and highest region in the state.
Which is critical because it's the state's coldest area. It gets occasional snow.
And it's a major wine-growing region because of its elevation.
Okay, heading further north up the coast.
You hit wide Bay Burnett, rich sugarcane and fruit production. Home to Bundaberg, famous for its rum, and Hervey Bay, which is the gateway to Kagari.
Then central Queensland takes over the central coastline.
Which is dominated by these expansive cattle stations and massive coal mining operations. You've got coastal hubs like Rockhampton and the tourist paradise of the Whitsunday Islands there.
Continuing north from there.
You find North Queensland, anchored by the major city of Townsville, still heavily dominated by cattle and mining. And then finally you get to far North Queensland.
The truly tropical region.
Yes. The Cape York Peninsula. It's home to the state's highest mountain, Mount Bartle Frere, the dense Daintree rainforest, and Cairns acts as the primary gateway to the most visited sections of the Great Barrier Reef.
And then you have the interior, the other 95%.
The vast, less populated interior. It's divided into three key areas. Southwest Queensland is mainly agricultural, cattle farmland. Central West Queensland, home to Longreach, again, cattle and historical aviation routes.
And finally, the Gulf country.
Or Northwest Queensland. It borders the Gulf of Carpentaria, and it's defined by savanna and major mining hubs like Mount Isa.
So given that immense geographical spread and the barrier of the Great Dividing Range, the climate diversity must lead to equally extreme weather.
Oh, it does. The source identifies 6 predominant Köppen climate zones, far beyond just a generic subtropical label. The variation is enormous.
So along the far northern coast, you have the monsoonal wet seasons.
Described as hot, humid summer, warm, humid winter. That's what you get in Cairns. Brisbane, a bit further south, is hot, humid summer, mild, dry winter.
But the elevated and inland regions are completely different. Stanthorpe, for example.
That falls into the warm, humid summer, cold, dry winter category, which explains those record low temperatures we mentioned. And the deep interior around Mount Isa has that harsh outback climate. Hot, dry summer, mild, dry winter.
This climatic diversity also leads to a world record rainfall, doesn't it?
It does. Mount Bellison Kerr, a mountain south of Cairns, holds multiple Australian rainfall records. It gets an astonishing annual average of over 8 meters of rain.
8 meters. To visualize that, it means the far north coast of Queensland is, by far, the wettest region in all of Australia.
A place defined by its tropical intensity.
And the temperature swings are just as dramatic. They illustrate the full range of the continent's thermal extremes.
Queensland holds the highest official maximum temperature, recorded in 1972 at Birdsville. It hit a blistering 49.5 degrees Celsius.
Which is 121.1 degrees Fahrenheit.
And in stark contrast, you have the minimum temperature records. The state's lowest is a frigid minus 10.6 degrees Celsius.
Or 12.9 degrees Fahrenheit, recorded at Stanthorpe. So you have this range from nearly 50 degrees above zero to 10 degrees below. It demonstrates the environmental challenge of governing this territory.
It does. And this complexity means that natural hazards are a constant inherent threat.
The central and northern coastlines are routinely battered by severe tropical cyclones.
We're talking about massive destructive storms.
Right.
Larry, Yasi, Ida, Debbie, they can completely reshape the landscape and infrastructure overnight.
And if the cyclones don't hit directly, the severe rainfall and the flooding often cause catastrophic damage.
Absolutely. The flooding event in late 2010 and early 2011 was one of the deadliest and most economically damaging in the state's history. It disrupted coal production for months.
And even the highly populated southeast isn't safe. It gets severe springtime thunderstorms.
Which bring the risk of damaging winds, large hail, torrential rain, and even tornadoes. The strongest recorded Australian tornado, an F4 on the old scale, happened near Bundaberg in 1992.
It's a climate that is as demanding as it is beautiful.
Well said.
Okay, shifting our focus to the modern era, let's look at the population and the economy that supports it.
Right. So while Queensland is the third most populous state, it presents this fascinating paradox when it comes to decentralization. It's actually the second most decentralized state in Australia.
Surpassed only by Tasmania.
Only by Tasmania, and that's a crucial distinction.
Because although 70% of residents are clustered in that SEQLD corner, that statistic often overshadows the immense vitality of the regional centers.
It does. And the urbanization statistics from our source confirm this. A remarkable 10 of Australia's 30 largest cities are located within Queensland.
10 of the top 30.
Exactly. So beyond Brisbane, the Gold Coast, and the Sunshine Coast, you have these major self-sufficient urban centers like Townsville, Cairns, Toowoomba, Mackay, Rockhampton.
And these aren't just service towns.
Not at all. They are autonomous hubs, largely driven by the specific mining, agricultural, or tourism industries in their immediate area. It reinforces that decentralized pattern of life and commerce.
Okay, so let's get a snapshot of the population composition. The 2016 census data shows the historical foundation is still very Anglo-Celtic.
Yes. The top nominated ancestries are English at 41.3%, followed by Australian at 37.9%, then Irish and Scottish.
But the success of modern migration policy has completely changed the international profile.
It really has. Nearly 29% of Queensland's inhabitants were born overseas. And the top sources for this population highlight the new global connections.
New Zealand, England, India, mainland China, and South Africa.
Which makes Brisbane, for example, the 26th largest metropolitan area globally by immigrant population. The demographic shift is just so clear.
And we also have to acknowledge the state's long-standing Indigenous population. In 2016, 4% of the population identified as Indigenous Australians.
Encompassing both Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders.
The linguistic profile reflects these trends. English is still dominant, of course.
Spoken exclusively at home by about 80% of inhabitants in the 2021 census. But reflecting the strength of Asian immigration, Mandarin is now the next most common language, at 1.6%.
And finally, religion. It's undergone a dramatic shift, mirroring trends across Australia.
It has. While Christianity is still the largest affiliation at 45.7%, the category of no religion has seen explosive growth. It now accounts for 41.2%.
And non-Christian religions collectively account for about 5%.
With Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam being the most common among them.
So we have this dynamic, highly decentralized yet rapidly urbanizing population. What does this engine produce?
Well, Queensland has the third largest economy among Australian states, and its structure is fundamentally shaped by its geography and its history.
The economic foundations, which were laid in the 19th century, they were explicitly export-oriented.
They were. The ports and railways were built specifically to extract wealth from that vast interior and ship it overseas. And this reliance on primary resources defines the state to this day.
That reliance is massive, particularly on fossil fuels and minerals.
Oh, huge. Key exports include enormous amounts of coal transported from the inland basins to the coastal ports on these vast freight rail systems. And bauxite, the raw material for aluminum, is another massive component.
Shipped from the massive mining operations in Weipa on Cape York and then processed into alumina at facilities in Gladstone.
A significant vertical integration spanning the length of the state. Other major mineral exports include silver, lead, zinc, gold, and copper.
And on the agricultural front?
Highly diverse. It takes advantage of all those climate zones. You've got massive cattle raising operations across the arid interior, but then you have intensive farming along the coast, producing sugarcane, bananas, pineapples, peanuts, and cotton.
But if primary industry is the engine's chassis, the tertiary sector is the fuel now. And it really dominates the state's economic life.
It does. Massive growth in retail, transportation, insurance, banking services.
And crucially, international education has become a monumental economic contributor.
Absolutely. In 2018 alone, there were over 134,000 international students enrolled in the state, overwhelmingly in Brisbane, and primarily from Asia, its massive export revenue and cultural exchange.
And Brisbane itself acts as the corporate nerve center.
It's categorized as a global city with strengths in mining support services, banking, IT, and property development. It's headquarters for major companies like Suncorp, Virgin Australia, Origin, and the Australian headquarters for Boeing.
But the state's most powerful brand and its leading tertiary industry has to be tourism.
Unquestionably, it's a sector that relies entirely on maintaining that natural wealth we discussed earlier.
Tourism is absolutely vital. It generates $8.8 billion annually. That's about 4.5% of Queensland's gross state product.
And it's a massive employer. It directly accounts for 5.7% of all jobs in the state.
The star attractions are, of course, the Great Barrier Reef, the Daintree, K'gari, the Whitsundays. But the urban centers hold immense appeal, too.
Right. Brisbane is consistently ranked as the third most popular destination in Australia after Sydney and Melbourne.
Attractions there include the South Bank Parklands, the Cultural Centre with the museums and galleries, and the Riverwalk Network.
And then you have the famous coastal regions that attract millions. The Gold Coast, especially Surfers' Paradise, is famous for its high-rises and beaches.
And it also holds the largest concentration of amusement parks in Australia. Dream World, Movie World, Sea World.
And up the coast, the Sunshine Coast offers a more relaxed vibe. Noosa Heads, Mooloolaba. It's also home to Steve Irwin's Australia Zoo.
And further north, Cairns is the ultimate tropical gateway to the reef. Tourism is the economic lifeblood that connects the vast geography to those dense population centers.
So let's move to the unique political landscape of Queensland. The governance system is a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, heavily influenced by the UK's Westminster model.
And the governor, currently Jeanette Young, represents the monarch Charles III.
But the truly unique political feature, the one that sets Queensland apart from every other Australian state, is its unicameral parliament.
It has only one house, the Legislative Assembly, and this structure has been in place since 1922.
The story of how they abolished the upper house, the Legislative Council, is one of the most famous anecdotes in Australian political history. It perfectly illustrates that boldness of the state's motto.
It was abolished by a group of Labour members, often called the Labour Suicide Squad.
Named because these members were appointed for the singular purpose of voting to abolish their own offices and the chamber itself.
Which means the result is a structure where there's no legislative check on the government's power. A bill just needs approval from the Legislative Assembly, and then it gets royal assent.
This streamlining can lead to periods of extreme executive control, a political boldness that, again, perfectly reflects that motto.
And this unicameral nature often works in tandem with the state's traditional political tendency, which is historically seen as quite conservative.
It is. And this structure paved the way for a long tradition of powerful, strong-willed, populist premiers.
The classic example being Job Jelk-Peterson, who was the state's longest-serving premier. His government was synonymous with this type of highly centralized populist governance.
And his power base was maintained structurally through what was known as the Bjorkmander,
which was a highly effective system of electoral malapportionment.
It was designed to grant disproportionate political weight to the rural, decentralized electoral districts, the areas holding the traditional conservative voter base and, critically, all that resource wealth.
So it's a political system engineered to privilege the resource economy over the population density.
Exactly. It protected the economic output of the vast interior from the rapidly expanding and often more progressively inclined urban core of SEQLD.
But despite that history of strong executive power, the state has moved to establish modern protections. The Statutory Charter of Rights, the Queensland Human Rights Act 2019.
A move to balance that traditional boldness with modern judicial fidelity.
Okay, let's look at how this identity translates into culture and symbols. Queensland has a really deeply rooted sporting and cultural identity.
It does, built around a unique set of official emblems. The koala was officially named the faunal emblem in 1971. The brolga, a large native bird, became the bird emblem in 1986.
For the botanicals, the Cooktown orchid was chosen as the floral emblem back in 1959.
And reflecting its mineral wealth, particularly the major sapphire fields in central Queensland, the sapphire was named the official state gem in 1985.
But a core defining element of the state's cultural identity is the color maroon.
Maroon was officially adopted as the state's color in 2003, but that was really just formalizing a long-held tradition.
And it was adopted solely because of its long, fierce association with Queensland sporting teams.
Especially in the state of origin.
Right. The sporting heart of Queensland beats to the rhythm of rugby league. The annual State of Origin series against New South Wales, it's not just a sporting event.
No, it's a deep cultural marker. The Queensland Maroons versus the NSW Blues. And the state has major NRL clubs like the Brisbane Broncos, North Queensland Cowboys, the Dolphins, and the Gold Coast Titans.
The sport is just central to the state's identity.
It is. And while rugby league is king, the state is well represented in other codes too. The Brisbane Lions and Gold Coast Suns and Aussie Rules, the Brisbane Roar in soccer.
And on the individual level, swimming success is a massive point of pride. So many international medalists come from the state's coastline.
And looking forward, the single biggest infrastructural and cultural driver for the next decade has to be the Olympics.
Brisbane will host the 2032 Summer Olympics. It's the third time Australia has hosted the Games, and that commitment is already driving immense public investment and physical transformation.
Which brings us neatly to modern infrastructure, a crucial component for managing those vast distances and the booming population.
Transport is vital. Brisbane Airport is the state's main international gateway, the third busiest in Australia.
And it's supplemented by international airports at the Gold Coast, Cairns, and Townsville. But the seaports are the real arterial exits for the export economy.
The Port of Brisbane is Australia's third busiest by value. But the true commodity giants are those regional ports.
Gladstone, Townsville, and the massive coal export facilities at Hay Point and Abbott Point, they just underscore the sheer volume of coal and minerals leaving the state.
For internal movement, especially in concentrated South East Queensland, you've got the integrated TransLink system,
Which coordinates buses, trains, ferries like the popular CityCat on the Brisbane River, and the Gold Coast's light rail network.
And the immediate future of transport is laser-focused on the 2032 Games. The Queensland Cross River Rail, a new metro network being built under Brisbane.
That's the largest piece of transport investment. It's designed to transform the city's capacity. It demonstrates that massive financial and infrastructural boldness in preparation for its global moment.
And finally, health services. They're managed by Queensland Health, which operates the public system through 16 regional health and hospital services.
A decentralized system that's absolutely necessary because of the distance, with major tertiary hospitals like the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital anchoring services across the key population centers.
So our deep dive into Queensland reveals a region defined by complexity and just profound paradox.
It does. We've established that the state is globally significant in size, larger than most nations, yet it's politically and economically driven by this intense concentration of population in its humid southeast corner.
Right, that contrast again. And we've seen that its massive wealth was built on a really turbulent and brutal colonial foundation, centered on widespread frontier conflicts and the use of blackbirded labor.
A foundation that was comparable in mortality to the Atlantic slave trade. And modern Queensland now balances those resulting vast resource industries, mining and agriculture, with a globally competitive tertiary sector.
Led by massive tourism and international education.
And its unique political structure, the unicameral parliament, the history of apportionment, is all engineered specifically to manage that inherent tension between the rapidly growing urbanized population and the conservative, resource-rich interior. All encapsulated by that motto, ad ax et fidelis. Bold but faithful.
So what does this all mean for the future? We'll leave you with this final provocative thought. It builds on the state's reliance on its climate, its natural beauty, and its rapid development. If Queensland's entire global brand and its economic future relies so heavily on that Sunshine State nickname and the immense appeal of natural treasures like the Great Barrier Reef, how will the state manage the accelerating environmental risks?
The increasing severity and frequency of cyclones and floods.
Exactly. And the ongoing pressure of population growth. The challenge for Queensland as it marches toward the global stage of the 2032 Olympics is how to balance the boldness of continued development with the faithfulness required to preserve the very climate and environment that makes it such a magnetic destination in the first place.